The days had folded into each other and mixed so that after 2 or 3 weeks, he only knew the time had passed in days because he had made a mark for each day on the stone near the door of the shelter. Real time he measured in events. A day was nothing, not a thing to remember. It was just the sun coming up and going down, some light in the middle. But events were burned into his memory, and so he used them to remember the time, to know and to remember what had happened. He kept a mental journal. There had been the day of first meet. There had been a day when he started like the rest, right up the sun, up after the sun, clean the camp and make sure there is enough wood for another night. But it was a long time after eating fish and looking for berries, and he craved more food, heavier food, deeper food. He craved meat, he thought, in the night now of meat. Thought of his mother's cooking, a roast or a dream of turkey. And one night he awakened before he had to put the wood on the fire in his mouth, making saliva, the taste of pork chops in his mouth. So real. All a dream, but it left him intent on getting meat. He had been working further and further out for wood, sometimes now getting a quarter of a mile away from the camp for wood. He saw many small animals. Squirrels were everywhere, small red ones that chattered at him and seemed to swear and jump from limb to limb. There was also many rabbits, large gray ones with a mix of reddish fur, smaller gray ones that he only saw at dawn. There were large ones that sat until he was quite close, then bounded and jerked 2 or 3 steps before freezing again. He thought if he worked at it and practiced, he might hit one of the larger animals with an arrow or spear. Never the small ones or squirrels. They were too small or fast. Then there were the fool birds. They exasperated him to the point they were close to driving him insane. The birds were everywhere, 5 or 6 to a flock, and their camouflage was so perfect that it was possible for Brian to sit and rest, leaning against a tree, with one of them standing right in front of him in a willow clump, 2 feet away, hidden, only to explode into a deafening flight just when Brian least expected it. He could see them, couldn't figure out how to locate them before they flew because they stood so perfectly still and blended in so perfectly well. What made it worse was that they were so dumb, or seemed to be so dumb, that it was almost insulting the way they kept hidden from him. Nor could they get used to figure out the way they exploded up when they flew. It seemed like every time he went for wood, which was every morning, he spent the whole time jumping and jerking in fright as he walked. One memorable morning, he actually reached for a piece of wood at what he thought would have been a pitchy stump at the base of a dead birch, his fingers close to touching it, only to have it blow up in his face. But on the day of first meet, he decided the best thing to do would be for a fool bird, and the best thing to try for would be for a fool bird. And that morning he set out with his bow and spear to get one, to stay with it until he got one, and ate some meat. Not to get wood, not to find berries, but to get a bird and eat some meat. At first the hunt had not gone well. He saw plenty of birds walking up and down the shore of the lakes to the end, then down the other side, but only saw them after they flew. He had to find a way to see them first, to see them and get close enough to either shoot them with the bow or use the spear, and he could not find a way to see them. When he'd gone halfway around the lake and jumped up 20 birds or so, he finally gave up and sat on the base of a tree. He had to work this out, see what he was doing wrong. There were birds there, and he had eyes, and he had eyes. He just had to bring those two together. Looking wrong, he thought. I'm looking wrong. More than I'm being wrong somehow. I'm doing it the wrong way. Fine. Sarcasm came into his thoughts. I know that. Thank you. I know I'm doing it wrong, but what is right? The morning sun had cooked him until his brain was frying, sitting by the tree, but nothing came until he got up and started walking again, and hadn't gone 2 steps when a bird got up. It had been there all the time while he was thinking about it to see them. Right next to him, right there. He almost screamed, but this time when the bird flew, something caught his eye, and it was the secret key. The bird cut down the lake, then, seeing it couldn't land in the water, turned back and flew up the hill into the trees. When it turned, curving through the trees, the sun had caught it. Brian, for an instant, saw as a shape a small pointed front, back from the head, a streamlined bullet shape to the fat body. It was kind of like a pear, he thought, a point at one end and a little body, a flying pear. That had been the secret. He had been looking for feathers, for the color of the bird, for a bird sitting there. He had looked for the outline instead. Had to look for the shape instead of the feathers or color. Train his eyes to see the shape. It was like turning on a television. Suddenly he could see things that were never there before, and in just moments, it seemed, he saw 3 birds before they flew. Saw them sitting, and got close to one of them, moving slowly. Got close enough to try to shoot with his bow. He missed that time, and he missed many more times, but he saw them. He saw the little fat shapes with a pointed head sitting in the brush all over the place. Time again he drew, held, and let arrows fly, but still had no feathers on the arrow. And they were little more than sticks that flopped out of his bow, sometimes going sideways. Even when a bird was 7 or 8 feet away, the arrow would turn without feathers to stabilize it and hit a bush or a twig. After a time, he gave up with the bow. It had worked out all right for the fish, but they were right in front of the end of the arrow. It wasn't any good for any kind of distance. At least, it wasn't right now. But he had carried his fish spear, the original one with the 2 prongs, and he moved the bow to his left hand and carried the spear with his right. He tried throwing the spear, but it was not good enough and not fast enough. The birds could fly amazingly fast, get up fast. But in the end, he found that if he saw a bird sitting and moved sideways towards it, not directly towards it, but at an angle back and forth, he could pull enough to put his spear out ahead of him to the bird and thrust lunge with it. He came close twice, and then, along the lake, not far from the beaver house, he got his first meat. The bird had sat, and he lunged at it with the 2 points and took the bird back into the ground and killed it almost instantly. It had fluttered a bit, and Brian grabbed it and held it with both hands and to make sure it was dead. He picked up the spear and the bow and trotted back around the lake where the fire burned down to growing coals. He sat looking at the bird, wondering what to do. With the fish, he just cooked them whole and left everything in and picked the meat off. This was different. He would have to clean it. It had always been so simple at home. He would go to the store, get a chicken, and it was cleaned and neat, no feathers or insides. And his mother would bake it in the oven, and he would eat it. His mother from the old time, from the time before, would bake it. Now he had the bird, but had never cleaned one, never taken the insides out or gotten rid of the feathers. And he didn't know where to start. But he wanted the meat. He had to have the meat, and that drove him. In the end, the feathers came off easily. He tried to pluck them out, but the skin was so fragile that it pulled off as well. So he pulled the skin off the bird, like peeling an orange, he thought, sort of, except that when the skin was gone, the insides fell out the back end. That he was immediately caught in a cloud of raw odor, a kind of smelly dung odor that came up from the greasy coil inside that fell from the bird. And he nearly threw up. But there was something else into that smell as well. Some taste, some kind of richness that went with his hunger that overcame the sick smell. He quickly cut off the neck with his hatchet and cut the feet off the same way. In his hand he held something like a small chicken, a dark, fat, thick breast and small legs. He set it up on some sticks on the shelter wall and took the feathers from the insides down to the water, to his fish pond. The fish would eat them, or eat it up the best they could, and the feeding action would bring more fish. On second thought, he took the wings and tail feathers, which were stiff and long and pretty, and banded and speckled and brown and grays and red, light reds. There might be some use for them, he thought. Might work them into the arrows somehow. The rest he threw in the water. Saw the small brown fish began tearing at it, and washed his hands. Back at the shelter, the flies were on the meat, and he brushed them off. It was amazing how fast they came. But when he built the fire up and the smoke increased, the flies almost magically disappeared. He pushed a pointed stick through the bird and held it over the fire. The fire was too hot. The flames hit the fat, and the bird was almost ignited. He held it higher, but the heat was worse, and he finally moved it to the side a bit, and there seemed to cook properly, except that it only cooked on one side, and all the juice dripped off. He had to rotate it slowly, and that was hard to do with his hands, so he found a forked stick and stuck it through the sand, putting his cooking stick in. He turned it, and that way found a proper method to cook the bird. In minutes, the outside was cooked, and the odor came through. It was almost the same odor than his mother baked chicken in the oven. He didn't think he could stand it, but when he tried to pull a piece of breast meat off, it was still raw inside. Patience, he thought. So much of this was patience, waiting and thinking and doing the right things. So much of all living is patience and thinking. He settled back, and the bird turned slowly, letting the juices go back into the meat, letting it cook and smell and cook. And there was a time it didn't matter if the meat was done or not. It was black on the outside and hard and hot, and he would eat it. He tore pieces from the breast, a sliver of meat, and put it in his mouth and chewed carefully. Chewed slowly and carefully, so he could get all the taste in. He thought, never in all the food, all the hamburgers and malts and fries at home, never in all the candy and pies and cakes, never in all the roasts or steaks and pizzas, never in all the submarine sandwiches, never had anything tasted as fine as that first meat.